Okay. The second half of chapter 7 kind of starts now. We're kind of switching gears and moving on from physical development to cognitive development. And we would be remiss if we didn't, when we talked about cognitive development, didn't talk about Jean Piaget. Remember, we talked about him in Psych 1. We talked a little bit about his first cognitive stage of development when we talked about infancy, the sensory motor period. Now we're going to move on to the early childhood period, where we typically find the preoperational stage. Now, the preoperational stage typically lasts from ages 2 to 7 and is all about symbolic thought, being able to think symbolically. So here we're talking language, we're talking words, pictures, representing the real through symbols. And pretend. So language ability is the greatest symbolic activity during this stage. We begin to learn to write, read, recognize that the random scribbles that we put on our page represent letters, and those letters represent words, and those words represent ideas, and that kind of thing. Symbolic play also happens. We usually start to pretend play at about 15 months, so we pretend, we might pretend that we're a dog, or we might pretend that a baby doll is our baby, or we might pretend to fix a car, or bake a cake, or whatever. Yeah, pretend play. It could be many, many, many things. We start to that about 15 months, and that ability to pretend and pretend about more complex things increases as we age. Now, quality of our play has long-term implications. Preschoolers who engage in violent pretend play are less likely to be empathetic, help other children, and more likely to engage in antisocial behavior later on. So we need to be kind of keep an eye on the quality of our preschoolers' play. Now, when it comes to symbolic or pretend play, egocentrism is a big one. First of all, 65% of preschoolers have imaginary friends. They're most common among firstborn children and only children than they are among children without siblings. Now, children with imaginary friends are usually less aggressive and more cooperative. They tend to be more creative than children without imaginary friends. They show better ability to concentrate and are more advanced in their language development. One of the things we are in the lookout for when it comes to this preoperational stage is egocentrism. And it's very indicative of this preoperational stage. It is kind of what we can think of as one-dimensional thinking. Thinking that they're sort of the center of the universe. Everything happens from their perspective. A lack of understanding of the world through others' perspective. Not even talking emotionally and psychologically, but actual physical perspective. They have a hard time looking at the world through someone else's eyes. And they tend to think that parents are aware of everything that's happening to them. Now, Piaget used the 3 mountains test to take a look at if egocentrism was present in children or not. And here's a little picture of it. This is in your book. And I've shared a video as well on our class resources with the 3 mountains test. And what we can do is we have these 3 mountains, and there's different symbols and sometimes different things that are placed on these 3, usually like plastic mountains or paper mache mountains. There might be you see a house here. Looks to me like a little person on the top of one mountain. There might be like shrubbery or trains or automobiles or whatever. And so the child is, on one side of the table and he's asked, or she, if there was a little girl, asked what he sees from his side of the table. And then he might be asked, and so he can tell you what he can see from his side of the table. And then he and the teddy bear might switch places. So the teddy bear takes his place, and he takes the teddy bear's place. And so then he's asked, well, what does the teddy bear see? Now, he should know, if the teddy bear could see, what the teddy bear could see, because he's been on that side of the table already. But he doesn't report that. He reports only what he can actually physically see. So he can't transpose the idea that the teddy bear is seeing something different than he is seeing. That everyone is seeing everything in the same way, just as he is, because he has that sense of egocentrism, that literally the world is only seen from his perspective. Now, one of the things that also we can take a look at and see how this works in the pre-operational stage is causality. Why do things happen? Why does the sun shine? Why is the sky blue? That sort of thing. They don't really have a good understanding of the natural causes of things. For instance, we might ask them, why does the sun shine? Because it wants to, or because I want it to shine, or because mom wants it to shine. They really don't understand about the natural causes of events, and they might be actually, the explanation of why things are happening can come from a very egocentric place. And this is known as pre-causal thinking. They also have what's called transductive reasoning, where they go from one event to another. Now, your book explains it very well. Says, for example, a 3-year-old may argue that she should go on her swings in the backyard because it is light outside, or that she should go to sleep because it is dark outside. That, and like your book says, that is the separate events, daylight and going on the swings or being awake, are thought of as having cause and effect relationships. So the cause of her going out to play on her swings is because it's light outside. We also see in the preoperational stage, animism and artificialism, and this is attributing human-like qualities to inanimate objects. For instance, like your book says, if you ask a child, why does the moon go away during the day? Well, because it's afraid of the sun. That rain and thunder are being caused by some big monster or something like that. That these natural occurrences have animate reasons for existing. Preoperational children may also have difficulty in making distinctions between mental and physical events. So between 2 and 4, they tend to confuse symbols and the things they play with. So earlier on, so one example of this kind of thing is, young children thinking that a dream is real. So that what happened in their dream or what happened to them in that dream is actually real. Great example is, dreaming there's a monster in your closet and them being afraid that there actually is that monster in their closet. Now, one skill that develops during this stage is what's called conservation. And this is the idea that the property of a substance, like a volume of or mass or number, remains the same even if you change their shape or arrangement. Now, very young children may not understand this. If you have, and your book talks about this, and if you look on page 153 in your book, you can see little pictures of a little boy sitting in front of 2 beakers of water, and the beakers are the same size and shape. In the second picture, there's a very tall, thin beaker of water and a very kind of short, fat beaker of water. And you can see that the water from the short, fat beaker of water is being poured into a long, tall beaker of water. And so when we look at the long, tall beaker of water and the short, fat beaker of water, we know that they actually do have the same amount of water. But because the long, tall beaker is taller, looks bigger, if you will, a child might say, well, that beaker now has more water. Not understanding that both beakers are holding the same amount of water, just they look different. They seem to have a different shape. And I've also linked to a video of this where you can see conservation as action. And not until a child understands that the volume of those two haven't changed just because they look different, can we say that they've moved to the concrete operational stage, which is the next stage. One of the things that happens with in this stage is also the concept of centration. And that's where conservation comes from. And centration is that we can only concentrate on one dimension of an object at a time. That is centration. Until we're able to decenter, until we're able to focus on two dimensions at a time, we won't achieve conservation. And then the same with reversibility. If we haven't mastered reversibility, we cannot achieve concrete operational thought. So here's that beaker slide that I was, beaker picture I was telling you about. We start with two beakers of the same size, same shape. We take the contents of one beaker, pour it into a different shaped, different size beaker, although that holds the same amount of water. A child who hasn't developed conservation yet would probably say that the tall beaker has more water than the small one, even though he's just been shown the water being poured into that beaker, that they haven't achieved conservation. They're so centered on that one dimension, right? They can't reverse that thought, that they can't focus on two dimensions at the same time, size and volume. Another example of this is this idea. You have a child that is shown 2 rows of pennies, 2 rows of 4 pennies. And they'd ask, which row has more, and they would say they're the same. Then the experimenter would move 1 row to make the second row look larger. And then the child would be asked the same question, which row has more pennies? Probably they were going to say, unless they move on to that concrete operational stage, if they're still in that pre-operational stage, they're going to say that the second row has more pennies, simply because the row is longer. It looks larger, therefore it must have more pennies. All right, the last thing we want to talk about when it comes to this pre-operational stage is the idea of class inclusion. And this is the idea of being able to categorize a new object or a new concept as belonging to a broader group of objects or concepts. Right? So your book talks about one of Piaget's classic experiments. Child is shown several pictures from 2 subclasses of a larger class. For example, 4 cats and 6 dogs. And then the child is asked whether there are more dogs or more animals. And the pre-operational child is simply gonna say there are more dogs than animals. Well, why? Because they can't think in 2 dimensions or in 2 subclasses at the same time. They can't think how many dogs versus how many animals, right? Because we know, therefore, and they can't do that. And so they can't compare the number of dogs, which is 6, to the number of animals, which includes the dogs plus the cats. They can't do that. They're not able to do that. So they're going to say there are more dogs.